Everybody here tonight. These amazing conversations keep coming, and tonight we have what's going to be a very powerful and moving experience. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Bradley McCallum. Brad addresses trauma and struggle, racial identity and representation, collective history, and individual responsibility. His work includes large-scale public projects, sculpture, paintings, photography, video, and self-portraiture. As the collaborative duo McCallum and Terry, he delved deeply into legacy of race in American culture, often incorporating profoundly engaging and personal narratives. McCallum has exhibited art exhibits and international art biennales, including the Contemporary Museum in Baltimore, Site Santa Fe, and Prospect One Biennial in New Orleans. That was in, what year was that?
2008.
2008, yeah. He currently has a show he'll talk about at the museum that I'm really anxious to go and see, the Legacy Museum. That is the new creation by the Equal Justice Institute down in Montgomery, Alabama. And I hope to get there while your work is still up there.
Wonderful.
And I want to begin the talk with a quote from curator David Spalding. This is what, I have this book from 2008, and I got it at Marion King Gallery in Atlanta. And I have to say, Brad, it just changed the possibilities for photography when I saw it.
Wow.
It opened things up in a way that that really profoundly moved me and moved me forward. So I want to thank you for that. David Spalding wrote in his essay, McCallum and Terry are preservationists of hang on, I gotta go get it back. Preservationists of endangered histories. And then later he suggests, if we actively recover the past and consider the ways we embody it, we can begin to forge the futures we imagine. And I feel like that is so relevant for this moment right now as well. And Brad, you've been doing this work forever since you've been working. And I think that we are all in this place where we need to understand how to embody our histories in order to move forward. So welcome, Brad, and take it, and the floor is yours.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. And so what I've put together to share with everybody today are just a handful of images, and talking really in depth about 3 projects, and giving you a short teaser at the very beginning of some of the work that I've been doing. I know for me, this period of COVID has been incredibly difficult and hard. I have asthma, so I have a fear of going into spaces I would otherwise not hesitate to go into. And I have also sort of been a witness to what has just been an extraordinary moment of seeing issues that I've cared deeply about come to the surface, and in a way that gives promise for change, in a way that I really hope happens. But also perhaps those years you were talking about working and hard is also shares my fear that somehow the positive strength and progressive movement will, or has the chance of being sort of turned against itself. And I so hope that that doesn't happen. But I want to thank you very much, Lori. I want to thank Sarah. I want to thank the Knight Foundation, who introduced us to talk together. And what is amazing is that we all had a visit literally maybe a week or 2 before all this happened. It was the day before I gave a talk at NYU, which is hosting an exhibition that literally closed a week later or 2 weeks later, that shows the work, and was giving a talk during that time as well. And we were, I think, slated for a studio visit. So this is, what's behind me is not what was in my studio then, but it is a sample of some of the collages that I've been working on that really become a kind of personal, poetic way of looking at, dissecting, and reassembling images from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And there are close to 60 of them that I've made now. But I'll start by sharing a screen and just sharing a couple of them. For me, these are building blocks. I don't know exactly how they'll be used, but it's very much a work in progress that I'm happy to share. Now let me see if I can successfully do this. We did have a great run through. So hopefully this is working. Can everybody still hear me? Yeah. Okay, great. So the format is really similar. I'm pulling images and then creating an associative edit from found images and creating these vertical totems that in turn will be used in different ways and assembled in long columns so that the images that are behind me are just a selection of those. And it's also a way for me to be thinking about and looking at and feeling, even if it's in a remote way, the intense energy that has re-energized the Black Lives Matter movement and has created a space where so many of our citizens have just had enough and have been stepping out and making really positive action, I think, for the most part. So let me see if it's clicking. So I'm going to talk more in depth about the body of work that brought us together. And it's titled Inescapable Truths. It's a series of works that I've been working on now for a little over 3.5 years. I've had the privilege and honor of working with the James Foley Legacy Foundation and Diane Foley, who's the mother of James Foley. For those who don't know, James Foley is the American journalist who was captured by ISIS, held hostage, and later executed in a video, a live video stream. And the video is very much a propaganda video. It was a way in which he was forced to read a statement in front of a video just prior to his being decapitated. And it's a very gruesome and difficult video. I began working and reaching out to Diane Foley and wanting to do this project because I wanted to, backtrack for a moment. I was teaching a course at Columbia Law School on the ethics of representing images with Patricia Williams. And we were looking at a lot of the cell phone footage that was coming out at that time of other police misconduct and police brutality cases, and began thinking about what happens when artists use images, what happens when images are taken out of context, what happens, what are the ethics around representing found imagery. And in the context of that, one of the students in this course asked, well, what happens when the image that's being represented is propaganda? And what happens, what are the ethics of the media companies who then represent that image? Are they amplifying the voice of those who are working within those realms of propaganda? And it was an appropriate question, and it made me think deeply and reach out and try to begin looking at James Foley's life. At that point, when you Googled James Foley, what you saw were an endless stream of postings and reposting of images of his execution, and you didn't really understand who this person was. And it was almost impossible to find images of the work he did as a reporter. And there was something that just felt profoundly wrong about that. And at that point, I reached out to Diane Foley and the Foley Legacy Foundation, and we began a conversation that lasted over a year before they agreed to let me work with them and have use of Jim's images in this artwork. What you're looking at and what I've been showing you are both the full image and in some cases details of oil paintings. This is a detail. And what you're looking at is actually a photographic scrim in front of the painting that is the photographic image and material from video stills that Jim shot. And the background is a painted representation of another video still, or sometimes a video still that's within moments of the image that's presented on the silk. And a few occasions you might find the writing and text from letters that Jim wrote while he was being held captive the first time. He was actually held captive in Libya, released, and then later captured again by ISIS. I wanted to give you guys a sense of the strength of the video footage that I've been working with, and just so you can have a sense of it. I'm going to show just a minute of what is a very tough video. It's a longer video, but I don't want to go into the full piece. This is a rough edit of a 2-channel video piece that will accompany, I hope, the exhibition of this material going into the future. But I give a little warning that there is one scene that you'll see before I turn it off, showing the remnants of bodies floating. And this is right after Gaddafi was killed. So I'm going to hold off an even tougher video piece just because I don't think that's needed right now. But I wanted to give you a sense of the quality of footage that I was working with in the making of these paintings. So I'm going to carry on, but that last little video clip showed this series. Oops, I'm trying to. That this series of the sort of a soldier, a rebel soldier, looking out of a broken green window, which was the stills from that were used on the painting preceding this, and this image was also drawn from part of the video that was shown in that. It gives you perhaps a sense of the kind of imagery and the chaotic and hectic nature of the footage that Jim shot as a war photographer. I think my responsibility in working with his archive was really to begin thinking about finding and distilling moments of time that both reflected his gaze and his own approach, but also began to speak in a larger metaphoric way to war and the impact of war and the way in which that it's not just the moment of battle, but it's also the broader communities that happen, that can be impacted. This is an image that was taken actually just a few days before he was captured by the Libyan Gaddafi's government and regime, and then held hostage for, I believe it was 60 days, 90 days. with another photographer who was working right alongside of him. And it's capturing this moment where they've gone up to the front line and are retreating back. The larger paintings, the silk ends up covering just a portion of the painted canvas. So you can see clearly, or you could see clearly in that, the relationship between the silk image, which is in the sort of center third to the left, and then the aspects of the painting that don't have a covering. And in other cases, like Mother's Lament, it's taking several different moments within a video sequence and re-stitching those together. So, hold on one second. Tosh, do you mind catching, my son's phone is going off. I want to see if I can get that turned off. We can just turn the volume down. The best laid plans. Sorry about that, guys. There were a number of works that Jim did, or that I've painted now. There's, of the full series, there are 4 paintings that also show aspects of Jim's writing. And when Jim was liberated from being held hostage the first time, he began writing on the back of hotel stationery as if even the paper itself was a rare commodity. So he wrote in this very focused and detailed way. And when you begin to dissect his writing, you begin to realize that in a way, many of his thoughts and reflections foreshadowed what must have been his feelings when he was captured by ISIS again. There was nothing recovered from Jim, his body, his clothing, his computer, his notes. But there is this way to think about Jim, both from the reflections of other prisoners that were held hostage with him, as well as from his own writing. There was an extraordinary documentary that was done on Jim called Jim, and I think it's still available on HBO or on YouTube, if I'm not mistaken, but it's worth watching if one wants to have a deeper understanding of his life. I would recommend it. This piece, Fallen, is a work that captures a very hectic moment of video footage, which is showing Gaddafi's, I guess it's his 4th son, who was killed in one of the final battles of the Civil War, and he was laid to be shown to other rebel soldiers and reporters to verify that it was Gaddafi's son. In this case, I also looked and found images online that showed his body being covered with the blanket. So the painted layer actually shows his body with the blanket covering up to his head in a more respectful presentation. The video footage is what's been many different frames of a rapidly moving video camera was stitched together to be able to create this image. So this moment in time never quite happened like this, but it's sort of condensing and making iconic, I hope, this moment. And also, in a way, trying to take what is a very brutal and difficult scene of war and softening it and making, in a way, a kind of metaphor to the Shroud of Turin, or to what happens when you shroud a body, and looking at that in another way. So, and Laura, you can give me a time check. If you're getting to the point where it's time, you have to just let me know.
You're doing good.
Okay, great. So this body of work is completed now. The video I still need to work on, and I thought I would spend my time in the Corona exile working on it, but I just sat down and I started looking at this footage and I couldn't bear. So I think stepping back and then coming back to it will make sense. And I think in a way, the importance of looking at Jim as a way of broadening our attention and respect and consideration for those who are out capturing news and telling truth in the pursuit for stories about humanity and war and the impact of war are even more relevant and important now when we have when real news is discredited as fake news and there's this blurring between truth and fiction, and there's a kind of exhaustive sense of what's right and wrong. So my hope is that this body of work, when it starts to be shown and circulating within the public, will not only give a solemn remembrance to Jim and to enable us to think about the life he lived, but also to think more broadly. And in a way, one of the other projects that I'm sharing with you today is a piece called Evidence of Things Not Seen. That is a collective portrait that shows 104 paintings of different heroes from the civil rights movement who offered themselves up for arrest after being issued arrest warrants when they refused to take the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. The idea of making a work that's a collective portrait from many different views or many different individuals have been part of my experience as an art maker. In the project with Inescapable Truths, I'm sort of doing that by looking inward. I'm creating a portrait of Jim, but through what has become a series of 30 plus paintings in various sizes and video work. So you end up getting to understand a little bit about this person through this sort of collective isolation of moments, I hope. Oops, I went the wrong way. So when thinking about giving this talk, I wanted also to highlight a historic project. And if you go to my website, bradleymccallum.com, it will link not only to Witness as one of the featured projects, but also you can connect to the historic website that has a whole series of audio testimonials. So I'm going to try a little ad hoc moment here. I'm going to start to play one of the sound clips from the youth testimony sequence. The artwork actually had 6 different sequences of audio from survivors of police misconduct and police violence to the testimony of police officers, as well as youth who've been impacted in different ways by police violence. This is a work that was first shown at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And this image shows right in the central nave, there was a 50-foot section of wall. So this image sort of isolates that installation. And each of these panels is showing a year within a decade of news clippings around police misconduct and police brutality. And in a way, it tried to demonstrate how this was not singular, isolated incidents, but there was a historic and systemic nature to incidences of police brutality by New York City. I moved to New York City immediately in the wake of Abner Louima being sodomized. So the protest images that we see today were taking place throughout New York when the city was in complete revolt of having a citizen be so brutally treated within the confines of the police precinct nonetheless. So I'm going to play this audio, and that'll be going on in the background. Lori, if this sounds weird, just give me the cut sign and I'll turn it off. So these are images of the call box tour.
She was doing this in front of a grocery store, like a little convenience store, a little bodega. And so they basically, he saw her, but the guy that was in the store, I guess saw what was going on and already called the police because he thought that they was going to rob him or whatever. So by the time they went to the store and purchased whatever they was purchasing, and came out, the police were already there. So
I'm going to pause right now just for a second. This call box tour, what lasted 21 days, and each day we moved these call boxes from a site where a moment of police violence took place to a location of accountability. So this wasn't in the immediate aftermath of those moments, but it was sort of at that point distilling and reflecting back. And it tried to look at the difficulty of accountability. This is in front of the federal courthouse. The first day of this call box tour was in front of Anthony Baez's home, where Anthony Baez was killed in an illegal chokehold, not unlike our recent experiences. So I'll play the audio again. These call boxes were amplifying the sound large enough so that if you stood next to them, you could actually eavesdrop and listen into the testimonial.
both of them, her friend put their hands up. So they both did, and the police officers were like, okay, which one of you got a gun? And she was like, I have the gun on me, I have a gun. So the one police officer said, take it out and put it on the ground slowly. Another police officer said, no, put your hands up. The other one said, put the gun slowly on the ground. So when she put it on the ground, they shot her upper abdomen. So when they, after they shot her, I think the store guy was also a witness. When they shot her a few times, they left her on the ground for like, I believe it was close to an hour, trying to make up a story because they was like, oh my God, she wasn't, they knew that, they messed up. So they was thinking of a story, left her on the ground like bleeding to death. And then they still handcuffed her, threw her in the car while she was on the ground, while she was bleeding. So her friend was screaming, going hysterical. They basically cursed her out, told her to, shut.
There are really, really tough stories within this sequence. And then there are other moments where family members talk about their loved one in really poetic ways. And so when you're standing in front of these call boxes, you are drawn in to the point where it becomes really tough to listen, and you sort of find yourself moving to another call box. And then you're washed in that story. So each of these become a different sequence of testimonial, and it's a way of using voice to make intimate what is otherwise a very public moment. This is in front of the precinct that Abner Louima was sodomized. And so you might ask, how did we get these totemic structures in front of, and in so many different areas? This was at a point when Rudolph Giuliani was mayor and had worked to prevent public art from being allowed to be installed. There was a group of artists who had done a series of installations using permitting for public art, and it was critical of the administration's legal battle against First Amendment rights. So that was not an option, but I ended up using a film and video permit. So these call boxes were used as props for a video that I was shooting. So there is a video that ended up being created that showed all of the respondents' responses to the testimonial. This is in front, yeah?
There's a question. Did you interview the victims, survivors, or collect their testimonials in other ways?
No, it's all testimony that I interviewed and worked with directly. And I began this project in partnership with the New York Civil Liberties Union. I was the artist in residence at the NYCLU. And then actually as the testimonial that I was recording became a very rich and full-bodied work in and of itself, we ended up parting ways with the New York Civil Liberties Union because I think they were interested in using the testimony in one way, and I was hoping to make sure that it was continued to be used in this kind of strictly for the art that it was given to me for. But then ended up partnering with a wide range of other NGO organizations working on the front lines to make the project happen. So the NYCLU ended sort of, and instead of there being just the singular partnering project, they became one of several partners, including the Anthony Baez Foundation. So this is in front of Amadou Diallo's home, just to give you a sense. So it was looking at not only the high profile cases, which this certainly was, but other cases as well. And then at the completion of this, these call boxes were reinstalled in front of the Bronx Museum. And inside were photographic representations and video from the full tour. I think in light of what's happening right now, it feels like this piece could just, it echoes with almost perfectly the challenges that are taking place. And it is, you know, I remember so clearly the intensity and the strength of the progressive movement around looking at creating systemic police reform. And then 9/11 happened. And there was a dramatic shift. All of the energy that was looking at how do you begin to create policy changes that will make a difference shifted. And the space, the bandwidth just wasn't there to look at the deeper question of how do we police ourselves? How do we engage and look at how do we shape a policing community relationship, which is the kind of question that I was hoping would come out of this body of work. And the last project I'll talk about is Evidence of Things Not Seen. And I think it is also relevant for this moment because it really underscores the importance of the Black Lives Matter movement. It is a work that celebrates the heroism and the dignity of the protesters who participated in one of the first seminal civil rights protests, the Montgomery bus boycott. And when we're looking at sort of the work that Jacqueline Terry and I did just preceding this body of work was a series called Whitewash, and it was working with images from the civil rights movement and reframing that. That passage you read from David Spalding was from that initial series of work that we were doing. And we discovered on the internet, the beautiful thing it is, a series of images of the mugshot sheets that were presented very differently. They were, as you would expect, mugshots pasted onto a page. And if you do a Google search for Montgomery bus boycott mugshots, you'll find the city archive and the Historical Society in Montgomery has made that publicly accessible material. And it was through that source that we were able to get digital images of the pages of mugshots. And then we scanned and worked and reframed those individual mugshots so that they were framed as one would be framed if you were sitting for a portrait of dignity. So it was about trying to rethink the nature of the portrait. When you look at those mugshots, their eyes were always at the center line of the image, and there was this ridiculous amount of white space over the head, and you felt the nature of the criminality in the portrait. But simply by reframing and recropping those initial thumbnail photographs, all of a sudden the source imagery became transformed into a kind of a place of dignity. And you often see people with smiles on their faces. You know, it underscored the fact that when people offered themselves up for arrest, they were doing this after having avoided taking the bus for months at that time, and walking to work and walking to church and walking to their other friends and community and grocery stores, and avoiding and collectively deciding not to take the city buses. And for this, they were issued arrest warrants. But there's a kind of pride and dignity that is represented here. And I think it is a testament to the potential we have now to think about our actions civically in a way that show the best of ourselves, and to learn from and build on the strength of these remarkable individuals. The images you're looking at are how this work was first installed. It was installed in the African American History Museum in New Orleans as part of Prospect One. So there was a soundtrack that that presented a sort of singing and a rechanting of each of the names, and the space of this historic home became a very sacred space. And we're nearly at the end. This is an image of the full 104 portraits as it was installed last summer at the Ford Foundation. I want to give a shout out to Natasha Becker, who is here, and with me was my partner, and she was a co-curator in this exhibition that showed a number of different artists' work. And I'm thankful to her for bringing this important and seminal work that Jackie and I did to the forefront. And shortly after installing this work, I had the chance to visit the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery. And I was blown away by the museum, the Legacy Museum, as well as the memorial, National Memorial for Lynching Victims. It's absolutely a destination place to go to. And as I was reflecting and thinking about this body of work, I felt like I just so wanted this body of work to go to Montgomery. And you know, it's one of those things where I'm not sure how many people know Brian Stevenson and know of the work he's done, but he was certainly a hero for me, and even more so after I visited the memorial. And I kept trying to think about and find someone who could introduce me so that my email wouldn't just be lost, but it would be put a point ahead. And this is now just a couple weeks before the exhibition at the Ford Foundation was closing, and that right person didn't come. So I just called the Equal Justice Initiative and said, can you please give me Brian's personal email? Sent him a heartfelt email about this work. And he wrote back within 30 minutes saying, you won't believe this, but this work has been keeping me up in the wee hours of the morning. And I really would love to bring it to Montgomery. So if you have a chance to go to Montgomery, they have a new space that's adjacent to the Legacy Museum that they're using to debrief and reflect and gather after what is an intense experience within the museum itself. And so evidence is being shown, at least in its initial configuration within the museum properties within this space. And we were able to get the vast majority of the paintings within the space that they had. But it's great to be able to have the work up there and to work with their historians, so that as we installed this work, we made sure that the descendants that are still alive from the protest and their families who have been active in the museum were given a priority positioning in the hanging. And the fact and the knowledge that during this difficult time, this is a space where the individuals of Montgomery can come and reflect is really so amazing. So if Brian, if you're out there listening, or if you ever hear this, thank you. It's one of the truly great honors to be able to have this work shown there. So that's it. I'm happy to answer questions. If people want to, my website is here, my personal email is here. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions that we don't get to during this session.
Thank you, Brian. Let's, I lost your picture. Hang on. Let's see if I can.
You lost mine?
Yeah, that's okay. But that's okay. You're quiet.
Oh, I should turn off I should stop the screen sharing, shouldn't I?
I think it's either way. So if people want to ask questions, you can unmute yourself freely. If you want to raise your hand I can look for that. So please feel free to unmute yourself or ask questions in the chat box. Either way is great.
Hold on one second.
Okay.
I'm trying to figure out how to do.
You're fine. I mean, if you want to just pause it, I think it's fine.
Okay.
So the call box.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to talk about James Foley as well, but I don't know where to start. I want to hold space and just congratulate you on, again, on opening up archives, helping us revisit them and to honor the stories and the people that tend to sort of like the archives have been diminished or forces are trying to help us forget, right? So I want to thank you for that. So I'm interested in this call box and the sound tour and the fact that everybody was leaning in. I just wanted to know, like, how did it look? How did it look when people were in that space? I mean, were there tears? What was happening to people as they were listening?
Great question. And what I will do is I'll find the YouTube link that shows the 2-channel video that Jackie and I made of the respondents. That was really the evidence of the interactions. And I'll make sure that everybody gets a link to that. It ranged. There were people who were profoundly moved. There were, I think what happens with call boxes is that they are such, at least at that time, New York City still had a lot of the old red fire call boxes that were part of the streetscape. So they were something that was very familiar, but something different. You knew what it was, but you never saw it activated in this way. Mm-hmm. And you saw that each of the call boxes had an image in the front of it. So there was something there to let you know what it was about. One image was just the detail of a police car, NYPD. So there was just enough of a hint that you knew what you were going to listen to was in this realm of police related stories or issues. But there wasn't anything else that was amplifying this within the progressive message. It really invited the viewers to listen. And the engagement and the intimacy would make people sort of stop in their steps and feel like they were at, the kitchen table or in someone's intimate space, not on the street. In cases where this took place, I mean, the audience changed radically too. When the work was installed in front of the police precinct where Abner Louima was sodomized, it's a narrow residential street, so there wasn't a big public that was walking by. And at a certain point, the the staff sergeant ended up standing on the front steps for hours, just telling, because the incoming changes shift, officers would come up and listen and try to listen and be interested and interact. And then the sergeant would say, no, this isn't for you, move on. And so there was, and it was difficult to get the work installed there. We had another, there's one day in this 20-day tour that was black because we had a permit to install in front of One Police Plaza, and that was initially denied. And so we had to go back and with the help of the New York Civil Liberties Union, allow that permit to be honored, and it was installed. So it really ranged, but I think in many cases, a very intimate and thoughtful listening, which is certainly what we were hoping for.
I think we must talk about the James Foley series. Anna Bodkin has a question. Anna, do you want to unmute yourself, please?
Yeah. Hi, Bradley.
Hey, Anna.
I was just typing my question, so I will kind of read it.
Okay.
So in the beginning of the conversation, you talked about the ethics of representation.
Yeah.
And then I had some issues with my screen.
Okay.
So I apologize if you already answered this question, but in the posthumous, what is essentially a posthumous collaboration with Jim Foley's work, you are, I believe, I think, honoring his experience. But I was a work correspondent for 15 years.
Wow.
And the images that Jim took that you're using are extractional. I mean, they're
extractional?
Yeah, they are, unnamed people, victims in a war zone. That's the reason I don't do journalism anymore, because I feel like I don't honor, I'm a writer, but I feel like I wouldn't honor the people I'm supposedly representing, right? So that's what I wanted to ask you. How do you get not how do you get around, but what is your process around? Because it literally is layered, but it also is ethically layered, right? You're giving space to Jim, but you're not, because his work isn't, or because of his death, and we don't know his relationship with the people, but I'm guessing, and I didn't know Jim. I mean, we had people in common, but I'm just trying to understand.
It's a great question. Part of that is by my reaching out to other peers that he worked with, and trying to make sure that not only is my handling of this work and the selection of the work, to make sure I'm not misstepping unintentionally, or with and I appreciate the fact that you described this as a form of collaboration, because it certainly is what it feels to be to me. It's as collaborative.
Well, you also explained that you went through, talking to his family and his estate. So you did the work that you would do if it were a living person. But not if you were a war correspondent in a war zone, you would not have done all these things.
That's absolutely true.
Which is where, we other.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a great question, and I don't have a absolute answer. It's very much a work in progress, in that a full showing of this work hasn't taken place. The Ground Truth Project is are you guys familiar with the Ground Truth Project? I would Google it, I would look at it. It's an amazing way of looking at journalism, from looking at what happens on the ground and empowering journalists to tell stories in a way that is really ethically driven. And the founder of the Ground Truth Project is Jim's former boss, and he has become a partner in the making of the narratives that will accompany the exhibition to talk about it, as well as some of the other war correspondents that were working with Jim. You know, pre-COVID-19, I had the crazy thought of getting on a plane and trying to retrace some of the connections that Jim had with people on the ground and trying to rethread that or try to look at that. So I don't know if there is a good answer to that. My hope is that the selection, that it doesn't step away from the gaze of Jim's whiteness in these communities, of my whiteness, of our shared kind of middle class upbringing. I think there is a lot that as I've come close to Jim's family, there's a lot that I see in his family that parallels my own. One of the things that, well, I'll just have to backtrack a moment. When I first sat down with Diane Foley and the Foley Foundation agreed to work with me, I said, Diane, I'm really looking to try to find some B-roll footage that maybe wasn't included in the news clips that I've been able to find on Global Post or these other independent news agency that he broadcast his work through, but really the footage that he might have taken just because something was beautiful or for whatever reason, that wasn't just what was going to be newsworthy. And Diane, you know, remembered, oh, I think I have something that might be useful. And she left this meeting in their in the office, which is just half a mile from their home, went home, brought back his backpack with several hard drives of Jim's in it, small lacy drives that they said, we've never looked at these. We never even thought to look at them until right now. And I don't even know if they work, but if you can use them, they're yours. And so literally I ended up using my laptop and plugging in the lacy drives and going through them with Jim's parents and looking at the different aspects of what were on the drives to make sure they were okay with me taking them and cloning them and then using that material. So there is an ethic that is there that I think holds up how to capture the generations of loss that of othered people when we are now in a 20-year war. It's really hard. So I think, you know, for me, this body of work aims to speak to what is, my son is 17. You know, he grew up, his entire life has been in war, you know, in this distant othered war. And I think that's a kind of bracket that is hard to fathom and understand. So by isolating and giving a very small portal to look through, which really ends up being Jim's experience over the course of not even a couple of years, you know, they're intense fragments over 1 year that I'm hoping it amplifies in a larger way. So
it's very powerful work, and it asks so many questions. Rilla Askew, I don't know if you've read her work. Rilla Askew, she has a book called Most American.
Okay, I have not seen that.
There's an essay in it about Jim Foley. She's a friend of the family. Geronimo is the name of the essay.
Yeah.
And then Hisham Matar has a book about going back to Libya to try to find his father, who was disappeared by the Gaddafi regime, and not finding him, called The Return. And you probably, but if you go back to talk to people, I think The Return might be an interesting and strange, and maybe talking to Hisham would be a strange and interesting way.
Oh, that would be great. I will reach out. Yeah. Wonderful.
Thank you again.
So Krista has a statement, and Krista, if you want to elaborate on it at all, just let me, feel free. But she writes, curious about the relationship of painting and photography in the series. You want to speak to that for a bit?
Sure, I'm happy to. It's interesting. I think of myself as a sculptor first. So I come to painting not as someone trained in painting, but from someone who cares about images and how images tell a story. And this relationship between the painted layer and the photographic layer is something that I've been looking at from the very beginning of my exploration with painting. And the series from Whitewash, which is the book that you were reading from earlier, was a moment when we selected archived images from the civil rights movement, and they very much were images that at that point felt like they had the same kind of musty age smell that you might expect, and dusty kind of archived sense of something that was in the past. And we ended up doing an exhibition in Beijing, China, and our initial goal was to literally embed the painted surface in such a way where the painting would eke through a whitewashed layer, so that over time the pain of that underlying image would bleed through that front surface. We arrived with a team of painting assistants to work with, and the medium that we were using to work with was acrylic, but none of these painters had worked with acrylic before. So there was this moment of panic because, 2 or 3 days in, it was clear that the work was looking really awful. And the lead painting assistant sort of said, Brad, why don't you just let us work in oil? The work is going to look beautiful, trust me. And I'm thinking, but my, sort of idea of the science of the materials bleeding would never work with oil. I just knew that. And so I listened and I gave up my idea, and the paintings shifted to oil and they started looking really lush and beautiful and everything you would want in the painted surface. But then there was a sense of, how does that initial idea of whitewash come, and how can we rethink that? And I did a series in my graduate thesis of images that were Xerox transferred onto China silk of in that case, mothers whose children were killed to gun violence. So there were shrouds that were installed. And I thought, well, maybe we could somehow transfer these images onto the silk so that they echo or respond to the painted surface. And that really became a breakthrough moment. We found a printer that was able to print directly onto the silk fabric. And the moment we put the silk over the painting, it both diffused and echoed, amplified, and made cinematic the painted image in a way that a painting alone could not do, and in a way that just a printed image wouldn't do either. It wasn't just the silk, but it was the relationship between the attention to detail and the time it takes to render an image in painting, and the fact that that respect is given to this moment of time that's already photographic, I think is the magic lesson that unlocked that body of work. And it really was, one of those, and I'm sure all the artists in the room realize that sometimes you're in a situation where you're pressed up against a deadline and you need to find a solution and you don't quite know what that's going to be. And then it happens. And literally the silk for that entire exhibition was printed a day and a half before the show opened. So it was incredibly intense and stressful, but it showed us a lesson. And there's a whole series of paintings that grew out of that, that continued the whitewash series, and then Evidence of Things Not Seen. if you go to my website, the body of work directly preceding this is called Weights and Measures. And I did not use the silk for that, but I ended up painting portraits of defendants of war crimes, one in hyper-realistic detail and the other as a black and white reversal. So the idea of the photograph ended up being demonstrated through the way in which they were painted. I went back to using the silk as a layered image with Jim's work because, you know, I wanted to reverse that sense of where whitewash made the image cinematic in its handling. With Jim Foley's archive, I feel like I'm making iconic these passages of time. And I'm trying to take and distill moments and then create the sense of iconic or seminal moment that hopefully stands the test of time. I'm not sure if it's happening, but that's the idea.
Thank you. And if it's, I would like to indulge your time. It's 8 o'clock,
Sure.
but Ricky has a question and a comment, and and it might lead to a few minutes, but I just want to.
I can go.
Okay.
I've been lucky. I've been
everyone.
drinking some wine here, so.
So Ricky writes, very impressive, moving across scales from global to local, demonstrating mastery of multiple techniques, painting, collage, photography, video, the use of found objects, images, to the use of archive images. I could go on and on, but what I'm particularly interested in is how you came to the topic of trauma and struggle. Can you tell your story? I know that's really a terrible thing to when there's little time, but.
No, it's a great question. I was a really, really eager young student who was just working nonstop in the studio and making a lot of work. And I came out of, I knew I wanted to be an artist when I was in high school and took a whole bunch of courses at the University of Wisconsin and took all of that energy right into my undergraduate work at Virginia Commonwealth University. And it wasn't until I took a course with Susie Gablik, who's become a dear friend and mentor and someone I really respect. If you don't know her writing, she's written several really seminal books that were widespread at that time. But in this seminar, one of which is Has Monergism Failed?, which is a great text and still is relevant today. And it was when that Has Monergism Failed was starting to circulate that she was teaching at VCU. And in this graduate seminar course that I was able to sit in on, she ended up asking the question, you know, what is the responsibility of the creative person in society? She didn't put a lot of extra onto the question, but it was about one's role, and implicit in that to begin thinking about society, your audience, who are you speaking to? And that question has been a beacon for me for all of my earlier seminal work, and continues in that I really care about trying to create work that gives audiences a way to engage and think about the tougher civic issues that face our society in deep and profound ways that hopefully can shift their understanding and perspective, so that the work becomes a active part of a civic conversation and a catalyst for people to think more deeply and responsibly. And so I have always been of the nature, and it's in my DNA, to listen to what other people, to listen to other people. And somehow that sort of quality then became amplified in what has become a process-based way of working. I hope that answers.
Thank you. Rivka has their hand up. You
Sure.
have the floor.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on that, Bradley, with a question of what has been the impact of doing this work on you? The previous question used the word trauma. the word that's been coming to me is horror. Like it's a constant theme. Certainly my response to the things you're showing in large part.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, I just noticed that several times you use the word sodomize, and almost in a as if it was just any other word. And I just wonder if you have to somehow cut yourself off from the horror in some way to work with these materials. And I just wondering what's the effect on you as an artist to be working so intimately with these kinds of images and sound and knowledge.
I hope I'm holding up okay. I don't mean to make light of it, but you know, there are moments that stand out that are remarkable in my career, and they're not the kind of moments that are normal, I guess. You know, when I did my graduate thesis work at Yale University in the sculpture program was a memorial for victims of gun violence. And there was a profound opening where the Yale Art Gallery, Art and Architecture Gallery, had 200 people from New Haven who were friends and family of the children who were killed to gun violence coming through, maybe even more than that. But the otherwise graduate thesis exhibition ended up being inundated by a community event, which was very profound and moving. What was even more moving was 2 months later when I was invited to show that work at City Hall, and rather than doing an opening, we did a private lunch with the mayor, the police chief, and the families who participated in giving their testimony and their portraits. And it was within this brown bag lunch where ideas of community policing that were just at the infant stage were shared by the police chief, and the family were talking, and coming out of that, there had been a group of survivors that continued to meet for years. And there's still a group of that continues to meet. So there's a way in which there's a profound sense of, wow, who would have thought? This is great. You know, there's a way in which the artwork is actually helping to shape policy and open understanding and awareness that is remarkable. It's hearing stories of from the staff at the Bronx Museum when the call boxes were there, that, you know, there would be people in the neighborhood that would stand guard and watch out for them because they felt like they owned them. You know, there are little pieces and slices and slivers throughout these works that make you feel like, okay, this is worth it, and then soldier on. I have to say though, you know, I shared this, that I thought I would get into the video editing of this rough cut that I showed you, which I think needs a lot of work, and it needs a way of layering and softening and moving the focus in and out. It needs a touch that that I haven't been able to give it, because just looking at that core material is so hard.
Yeah.
So I'm maybe more impacted now than I have before, but yeah, I still wouldn't want to make any other kind of work. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. So I definitely have to close the evenings.
Okay.
Again, thank you so much for sharing this space, and thank you everybody for coming. Brad, I love you more than I did yesterday, so thank you very much.
Lori, I just have to say, when I came and met, and Sarah, if you're here, I mean, you guys are terrific. What you guys are doing is amazing. And then for you to say, oh, what, Brad, I know you. Yeah, we got to work together. Like this, I hope, is just the first of what might be a continued dialogue and conversation. I really applaud the work you guys are doing.